The story begins with a striking contrast between two very different worlds, one of wealth, power, and privilege, and the other of grit, skill, and resilience. The female CEO, known for her commanding presence in corporate circles, carried herself with the air of someone used to having people bend to her will. Her lifestyle reflected her immense success, with expensive clothes, chauffeur-driven cars, and a sense of superiority that colored how she viewed others. On the other hand, the mechanic she encountered lived a life far removed from boardrooms and skyscrapers, spending his days in a grease-stained workshop, with hands hardened by years of labor, solving problems with nothing more than his wits, experience, and a set of tools. Their meeting was not the kind of encounter that either expected, yet it became a turning point defined by arrogance, doubt, and ultimately, the shattering of preconceived notions. It happened on a day when her luxury car, a status symbol that matched her larger-than-life reputation, broke down unexpectedly. For someone so used to smooth efficiency and flawless execution in her professional and personal life, being stranded by a failing engine was more than an inconvenience. It felt like an insult to her identity. When the car was towed to a small local garage, she was already in a mood of irritation, her patience worn thin. She was greeted by the mechanic, a man whose appearance did not fit the image she had in her mind of someone capable of repairing such a high-performance machine. His worn clothes, oil-streaked hands, and quiet demeanor struck her as out of place against the gleaming car she drove. In that moment, her perception narrowed, and she assumed superiority not only because of her wealth, but also because of the difference in their social status. She looked at the engine skeptically, then at him, and with a tone that carried both mockery and disbelief, she uttered the challenge that would frame the entire encounter. "Fix this engine and I'll marry you," she scoffed. The words delivered with a sharp laugh meant to remind him of the vast gulf she believed separated them. For her, it was a joke, a way to underline how impossible she thought the task was. The engine had confounded other mechanics before, its complexity making it almost untouchable, and she assumed he would fail just like the rest. In her mind, the statement was a dismissal, a way to assert that people like him had no place achieving what was reserved for those with far more resources and expertise. But what she failed to see was the quiet strength in the mechanic, a man whose life had been defined by the underestimation of others. He had grown used to being judged by his appearance, his background, and the color of his skin. Yet each time, he let his skill speak louder than any prejudice could. In his eyes, engines were not just machines. They were puzzles, stories written in metal and fire that he knew how to read better than most. Where others saw impossibility, he saw an opportunity to prove himself once again. Her challenge, though meant as ridicule, lit within him not anger but determination. He accepted it silently, with the calm assurance of someone who had been here before. Someone who knew that the best answer to mockery was undeniable success. As he rolled up his sleeves and leaned over the engine, the workshop became a stage where two worlds collided. The CEO, arms crossed, watched with a mix of impatience and curiosity. At first, she smirked at his confidence, assuming it would all unravel soon. Yet as minutes stretched into hours, her expression began to shift. His movements were precise, deliberate, each turn of the wrench guided by an understanding that came not from books or classrooms, but from countless hours of experience. He listened to the hum of parts, adjusted wires and bolts, and slowly pieced together the machine's hidden story. She began to notice something unsettling to her pride. He wasn't fumbling, he wasn't guessing. He was commanding the engine in a way that revealed mastery. The contrast between her mockery and his quiet resolve grew starker with each passing moment. For the mechanic, this was more than just a repair. It was a declaration that talent cannot be confined to stereotypes or dismissed by arrogance. For her, every click of his tools chipped away at the walls of superiority she had built around herself. Watching him work forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth that her assumptions about people, shaped by privilege and prejudice, were not only wrong but dangerously narrow. As the day wore on, the hum of the engine began to return. Faint at first, then stronger, like a heartbeat coming back to life. The CEO, who had once been so sure of his failure, found herself leaning forward, unable to hide her fascination. She was witnessing a display of raw skill and intelligence that no amount of wealth could buy, a kind of expertise forged not in boardrooms but in long hours of persistence. By the time the engine roared back to life, purring smoothly under his command, the room was filled with a silence more powerful than applause. The challenge she had thrown so carelessly had been answered in full. She had mocked him, reducing his worth to a punchline. But he had turned that moment into a demonstration of dignity and capability. The balance of power between them had shifted, not through words or wealth, but through the undeniable truth of his success. For her, the laughter with which she had delivered her challenge now rang hollow, replaced by the heavy weight of realization. For him, the victory was not about her words, but about standing tall against yet another instance of prejudice, proving that excellence cannot be confined to status, race, or assumption. The mechanic stood before the car with a quiet focus that many mistook for hesitation, but those who knew him understood it was the beginning of a process he had repeated countless times. Engines to him were not just machines, they were living systems with personalities, quirks, and hidden stories, and he had trained himself to listen to them, the way a musician listens to notes in a symphony. When the female CEO mocked him, assuming he would falter in the face of a complex and high-performance engine, she could not see the years of experience behind his calm expression. Every bolt, every wire, every gear was familiar to him, not because he had studied them in prestigious schools or trained under luxury brand workshops, but because he had lived and breathed engines since he was a child, teaching himself with whatever broken machines he could find. What she thought was impossible was, to him, a puzzle waiting to be solved, and his determination to meet her challenge went deeper than her words. It was rooted in a lifetime of having to prove his worth where others had dismissed it. The engine before him was notorious for being temperamental, its design a blend of power and precision that often required specialized training to service. Other mechanics had tried before him and failed, leaving behind a trail of frustration and confusion. But he approached it differently, with patience and intuition. He did not rush or flail in frustration. Instead, he let the machine tell him what it needed. With each sound, each small vibration, he pieced together the mystery. His tools became extensions of his hands, moving with a confidence that came from countless late nights spent under dim lights in his workshop, fixing engines that everyone else had written off as dead. He drew on that memory bank of problem-solving, recognizing familiar symptoms hidden within the chaos of this particular engine. The CEO watched him, her arms folded, her smirk fading slowly as time passed. She had expected him to give up within minutes, to stumble, to admit defeat, but what she saw instead unsettled her pride. He worked without fanfare, without arrogance, his concentration unbroken by her presence. There was no hesitation in his movements, and every now and then, when he adjusted a part or tightened a bolt, the engine would respond, its silence giving way to faint sparks of life. It was as though the machine respected him, obeying him in a way it had resisted others. To her it seemed surreal that someone she had mocked only moments before could display such mastery, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt not in him, but in herself. Hours passed, and the workshop seemed to shift in atmosphere. What had begun as an act of ridicule had transformed into a quiet performance of resilience and genius. Sweat dripped down his brow, his hands dark with grease, yet his focus never wavered. Every challenge the engine presented only seemed to fuel him further, as though he thrived on proving that no machine was beyond repair if approached with enough patience and skill. The onlookers who had gathered after hearing of the CEO's audacious challenge began whispering among themselves. Some had come expecting to see him fail, amused by the lopsided contest, but now they too were silenced, drawn into the unfolding spectacle of a man who refused to be limited by anyone's expectations. When at last the critical moment came, he turned the key, and the engine roared to life. It was not a hesitant cough or a stuttering start, but a full, rich growl, smooth and powerful, the sound of a machine restored to its prime. The workshop reverberated with the vibration, a deep hum that filled the air like a declaration. For the mechanic, it was confirmation of what he already knew, that skill and perseverance could achieve what others deemed impossible. For the CEO, it was a moment that forced her to face the truth she had avoided. The man she had mocked, dismissed as unworthy of her time, had accomplished what no one else could. The irony of her own words now weighed heavily on her. Fix this engine, and I'll marry you had been intended as a cruel joke, a statement to underline the impossibility of the task. But now, with the engine purring smoothly before her, she realized her arrogance had been exposed. She had underestimated not only his technical ability, but also the quiet strength that came with his character. He had taken her mockery and turned it into an opportunity to prove not just to her, but to everyone watching that worth is not measured by wealth or status, but by what one can truly accomplish when put to the test. The mechanic himself did not bask in the moment with arrogance. He did not gloat or remind her of her words. Instead, he stood back, wiping his hands with a rag, the engine's hum speaking louder than any triumph he could declare. His victory was not in humiliating her, but in showing that dignity and talent could stand tall in the face of prejudice. The CEO, for all her power and wealth, was left speechless, her authority undercut not by defiance but by undeniable excellence. What made the moment powerful was not just the repaired engine but what it represented. It symbolized the shattering of assumptions, the exposure of the fragile foundation on which her mockery had been built. Where she had seen only a poor mechanic, he revealed a master of his craft. Where she had placed a barrier of class and race, he dismantled it with persistence and brilliance. The scene became more than a reparette, was a reversal of roles, where the one mocked stood victorious, and the one mocking was humbled into silence. Her mockery had been born from arrogance, a careless remark meant to put him in his place. But once the engine roared to life, that arrogance dissolved into something entirely different. She had built her career on control, on being the one who commanded attention and respect in every room she entered. Yet here, in this modest workshop, the roles had reversed. The man she had dismissed so easily had taken an impossible challenge and turned it into a statement that reached far beyond a single repair. What unfolded before her eyes was not just about fixing an engine, but about breaking apart assumptions, revealing a strength and brilliance that she had been blind to see until it stared her in the face. For the first time in years, she felt small in a way that had nothing to do with status or power. She had been so sure of her position, certain that her wealth and success insulated her from challenge. But the mechanic had stripped away that illusion not with words but with quiet competence. His hands, stained with grease and hardened by labor, carried a dignity she had overlooked, and now that same dignity commanded her admiration. The mocking challenge she had offered as a cruel joke no longer seemed funny. Instead, it weighed heavily on her, every word echoing in her mind with a new meaning. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." What once had been laughter now felt like a promise broken by her own pride. She watched him stand silently by the humming engine, not basking in victory, not demanding anything from her. That silence spoke louder than triumph could. It reminded her that he had never needed her validation, never needed her approval. He had answered her doubt not to please her, but because excellence was ingrained in who he was. That realization unsettled her in ways she could not ignore. She, the CEO who had mocked him, now found herself filled with respect she could not hide. And it was respect born not from pity or obligation, but from recognition of true mastery. Around them, whispers filled the air. The onlookers who had gathered out of curiosity were now witnesses to a shift none had expected. The story of her challenge and his success would not remain confined to this garage. It would spread, carried on by those who saw the moment as something larger than just a repair. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that greatness does not always come dressed in tailored suits or corporate power, but often in the quiet resilience of those who are underestimated. Her image as an untouchable figure of authority was cracked, and in its place emerged a woman forced to confront the limits of her own judgment. She found herself replaying every detail in her mind, from the way she had laughed at him to the calm determination in his eyes as he accepted the challenge. She remembered the way she had folded her arms, certain he would fail, and the way her confidence had crumbled with each precise movement of his hands. What astonished her was not just the fact that he had succeeded, but how gracefully he had carried himself in the face of her mockery. He had not snapped back, had not tried to defend himself with anger or pride. Instead, he had let his work speak for him, and in doing so, he had spoken louder than any insult could. Admiration crept into her thoughts unbidden. She had spent years surrounded by people who bowed to her authority, who praised her out of fear or ambition, but here was a man who had no need for flattery, who had faced her derision head-on and turned it into a stage for his brilliance. It was not just his technical skill that struck her, it was his composure, his strength of character, his refusal to let humiliation define him. That, more than anything, demanded her respect. The moment carried an irony she could not ignore. She, who had mocked him by tying his skill to an impossible promise of marriage, now felt the weight of those words pressing against her conscience. She had intended them as ridicule, yet now they lingered as a reminder of how wrong she had been. The laughter she had once used as a weapon now haunted her, replaced by admiration she had not chosen but could not help. Something about the way he stood, quietly wiping his hands, made her see him differently, not as the mechanic she had dismissed, but as a man whose worth shone brighter than the titles and wealth she had clung to. Her life had been built on deals, negotiations, and power plays, but this was something no deal could buy. Respect earned in the silence of a workshop held more weight than all her corporate triumphs. It forced her to reconsider not just her view of him, but her view of herself. How many times had she looked past people, assuming their value based on appearances, dismissing them before they had a chance to prove themselves? How many talents had she ignored because they did not fit the image of success she carried in her mind? The mechanic's victory was not just his, it was a mirror held up to her own failures and judgment. The transformation of her perspective was slow, but undeniable. She no longer saw a poor man standing in front of her. She saw resilience carved out of struggle, genius born from persistence, and dignity that could not be mocked away. The challenge that began as a cruel jest had become the catalyst for her awakening. She had admired power in many forms throughout her life, but none of them compared to the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who proved her wrong without uttering a single boast. As the engine continued to hum, the sound filled the workshop with more than mechanical precision. It carried with it the echo of a life lesson she would never forget. Her mockery had turned to admiration, her certainty to humility. The event had shifted the ground beneath her feet, changing the way she looked at not only him but at the world around her. What had begun as a moment of ridicule ended as a moment of transformation, one that would follow her far beyond the walls of that garage.